All right, well, it is right at the hour. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Oh, I see a note saying that somebody still can't hear. I want to make sure everyone can hear before we get started. I can try to speak more loudly if that will be helpful. Okay, great. Thank you. Getting through these first logistics here. All right, I will speak up for those of you who have a softer volume. Okay, great. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Sheila Rabin. I'm the ORCID US Community Specialist at Lyrasis, and I provide technical and community support for institutional members of the ORCID US community. So this webinar is geared towards institutions who are either just getting started with ORCID, or maybe you've been thinking about ORCID, but you haven't really started to think about it that hard yet. So we're going to be covering the benefits of ORCID for research institutions. And this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for future viewing. So in terms of learning outcomes for today, by the end of this session, you should have an understanding of the benefits of ORCID for research institutions, identify ways that ORCID could be used to streamline processes in local systems and workflows, and conceptualize a plan for local adoption of ORCID with knowledge of where to go to find more information. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to type them into the chat or hold on to them for the end, so we will address questions at the end of the session. So before we can fully understand the benefits of ORCID for research institutions, we're going to first need to have a basic understanding of what ORCID is and how it works. So to make sure that we're all on the same page to get started, we're going to do a quick review. So ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier, and it was primarily created to help with name ambiguity in the realm of research and scholarly communication. ORCID provides a unique 16-digit number assigned to an individual to distinguish them from other individuals and link them to their affiliations and contributions throughout their career. The ID is formatted as a dereferenceable URI that links to an individual's ORCID record. Anyone can get an ORCID ID for free at orcid.org/register. So the ORCID record contains information about an individual's name and their ORCID ID, as well as alternate names, location, email addresses, and biographical details. ORCID data could also include information about an individual's education, employment, any funding they may have received, and works like publications, presentations, performances, that kind of thing. And individuals have full control over the content and visibility of the data contained in their ORCID record, and they can grant permission to affiliated organizations to read, write, and automatically update their information. I wanted to also point out that ORCID has recently launched support for additional types of affiliations, including qualifications in addition to education, invited positions and distinctions, and memberships and service. So now ORCID records can potentially contain even more data about researchers' scholarly activities. ORCID is an open, nonprofit global initiative where the vision is to create a world where all who participate in research, scholarship, and innovation are uniquely identified and connected to their contributions and affiliations across time, discipline, and borders. While ORCID was created to help with name disambiguation, it's also much more than that. ORCID provides interoperability in scholarly communication workflows across the research ecosystem, connecting individuals with their affiliations and contributions, and connecting multiple systems with each other, including publishing, grant funding, and research institution workflows, represented here in the role of employer. Organizations can integrate ORCID into digital platforms and workflows to reduce administrative burden and connect ORCID ID records with institutional repositories, publishing platforms, HR systems, grant applications, and more. The ORCID vision is best served when the entire scholarly communication ecosystem utilizes ORCID, with the individual researchers at the center and multiple stakeholders and systems connecting with researchers' ORCID records, and thus each other. As with any ecosystem, the whole system works best when all parties are contributing. So ideally, the individual can provide things like their name and biographical information. Research institutions can provide education or employment information at the very least, while funding organizations can add information about grant funding received, and publishers can update records with works and peer review information, for example. So when all stakeholders are plugged into the ORCID registry, they can all benefit from the data shared. Research institutions across the globe are increasingly interested in ORCID because it provides a unique, persistent identifier for individual researchers and serves as a reliable infrastructure for streamlining workflows across the scholarly communications ecosystem. So ORCID can help research institutions to mitigate confusion caused by name ambiguity, assess and track individual contributions and measure institutional impact, assert trustworthy and accurate affiliations, and save time, ultimately reducing administrative burden for both administrators and individual researchers. So at the institutional level, ORCID can have an impact across multiple campus units, and in fact, the more people and systems using ORCID, the more benefits will be seen by all parties involved. Some common examples of ORCID use in various areas of a research institution include the libraries, for example, integrating an institutional repository, publishing platform, or data management system with ORCID to track and link individual contributions and works to affiliated researchers. The graduate school or various academic units, such as maybe a medical school or a law school, or really any academic department, can use ORCID data to connect with students and assess the impact of their programs during enrollment, as well as keep up with student activities after graduation to see where the institution has impact beyond the classroom. Also, the research office, provost, or other areas responsible for tracking and evaluating faculty activities can configure a current research information system, or CRIS, to use ORCID data for faculty evaluations, promotion, and tenure. The grants office can utilize ORCID to streamline the grant management process, making it easier to track and manage grant applications, review, and reporting with both internal and external partners. And finally, central campus units like campus IT and HR can leverage ORCID in multiple campus systems to streamline information flow between systems. So for example, by linking ORCID with a campus ID management system, multiple units can be plugged into that data flow, saving time and reducing that administrative burden when common data needs to be used across multiple platforms. So this graphic is actually from the Czech Technical University in Prague, and it shows a link between their central ID management system and ORCID, with data flowing between local systems. And this is just one example of how ORCID can provide an opportunity to streamline data flow between institutional systems. So now that we've covered some ORCID basics and an overview of how ORCID can be used across different campus units and systems, let's take a closer look at the overall benefits for research institutions. So at the most basic level, ORCID allows research institutions to mitigate confusion that may be caused by name ambiguity. So for example, if you are looking at this article and you're trying to identify a contributing researcher associated with your institution whose name is, let's say, John Zhang, as you can see here, there are multiple people listed with the same last name, and many of them have the same first initial. So in this case, it's really impossible to tell which J. Zhang you need to refer to. And because individual researchers are central to the research ecosystem, and faculty, staff, and administrators are often dealing with multiple individuals and their data every day. Let's say you're working with a faculty member whose name is Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia, as you can see here. However, over the course of her career, she's used different variations of her name when applying for funding or submitting reports or publishing research. So let's say she might just use Sofia Garcia, or just a first initial there, or maybe the first two initials. There's lots of different ways that her name could be formatted. So with all of these different name formations, it's pretty difficult to tell if all of these listings are referring to the same person. And there may be several other individuals at your institution or elsewhere who are also known as Sofia Garcia. Or you could have a researcher who was previously known as Sofia Garcia but have changed names over the course of their career. So how do you know who is who? And that's really where ORCID comes into play. So with an ORCID ID, it really doesn't matter what name a researcher is going by. They can be linked to their contributions and affiliations through their unique ORCID ID. ORCID allows researchers to include as many different variations of their name as needed, including support for different languages, accents, and diacritics. As you can see here, this person has been able to include their name transliteration as well as in Chinese characters. And ORCID also allows researchers to link with other identifiers they may have, like a Scopus ID, for example. And once an individual has an ORCID ID, a link to their ORCID record can be included on any publication, application, report, or other material where the researcher's name is mentioned. For example, all of the authors of this article, seen in bioRxiv, which is a biology preprints platform, they all have an ORCID ID, which is indicated by the use of the green ID icon next to each person's name, and that links each individual contributor to their ORCID ID record. So if we were to click on one of the names, let's just go with the first one that's listed here, we will be taken to that individual's ORCID record, which contains a wealth of disambiguating information about them, including multiple other name variations that this person goes by, their biography, their education information, Scopus ID, websites, etc. So this way we can distinguish this person from any others who may go by the same name, or connect this person with other contributions they may have made that may be listed under a different name or name variation. So some examples of institutions taking advantage of this name disambiguation. Cornell University, they are listing ORCID IDs within their archive ePrint platform. As you can see here, they're providing a link to the individual's ORCID ID record to provide that disambiguating information about this person and their works and contributions. And similarly, the University of Minnesota is using the ORCID functionality within PURE, which is a research information system, to associate the ORCID ID with researcher profiles. So you can see the ORCID ID listed at the bottom there, and subsequently they are displaying ORCID IDs on the individual's public-facing profile pages to provide a better understanding of who is who. And so if we're to click on this ORCID link, we would be taken to the individual's ORCID record, where we could see more information about that person. So from here, once institutions have the ability to distinguish between researchers, ORCID can be used to assess and track individual contributions and thus measure and report on institutional impact. So Colorado State University's ORCID LibGuide that you see here does a really good job of describing the current general state of affairs when it comes to faculty reporting and related activities, stating that an ongoing problem for research organizations is the ability to accurately and easily identify and link researchers and scholars with their professional activities. Even if organizations implement local faculty profile or research information systems, these require ongoing and frequently manual updates, and the information does not travel with the researcher as they move between organizations or even departments. So when it comes to research information reporting, grant proposals, publishing, peer review, promotion and tenure, that kind of thing, researchers are often asked to fill out a variety of forms over and over again for different campus units. And then administrators have to review those forms for accuracy to make sure that the data entered is correct, up to date, and affiliated with the correct individual in the institutional systems. So ORCID actually provides a solution for this by allowing institutions to integrate their systems with the ORCID registry and read data from ORCID records for easier and more reliable data transfer and reporting. So there are two ways in which ORCID data can be populated in an individual's ORCID record. The individual can either manually add their information, or affiliated organizations can ask researchers for permission to add data on their behalf. For example, on each of these ORCID Works entries, you can see that the source of the data is a person's name. This means that the individual entered this information manually. However, on this example, you can see that the source of each of these works is DataCite, which means that the works published in Figshare, in this case, were automatically added to the individual's ORCID record by DataCite with explicit permission from the researcher. When multiple researchers have an ORCID ID with their education, employment, funding, works, and other activities populated in their ORCID record, research institutions can connect with those individuals' ORCID records to obtain data for reporting and assessment. In this way, researchers only have to enter their information once, and it can be reused multiple times by the systems they are connected with. To make these connections, institutional systems first need to be configured to work with the ORCID Application Programming Interface, or API, so that data can be shared directly with the ORCID registry. Many research institutions in the United States are using Current Research Information Systems, or CRIS, to keep track of data used for faculty review and reporting. There are several vendor-hosted CRIS options available that already support ORCID integration out of the box, such as these shown here. And these are just a few of the popular options available, but you can find more information about vendor systems that support ORCID on the ORCID website. So, for example, the Digital Measures Activity Insight ORCID integration that was released in June of 2018 allows researchers to connect their ORCID ID with their digital measures profile with the ability to import publications information from ORCID into digital measures, as you can see here. And very similarly, this is an example from Boston College, where they're using the ORCID integration with Faculty 180 to import works from ORCID into Faculty 180 to be used in faculty reporting, assessment, and review. And in addition to using these vendor systems with ORCID, research institutions also have the ability to build custom ORCID integrations to measure the wider impact by remaining connected with former affiliates after they leave the institution. So many organizations have started to set up what we call create and connect interfaces that prompt researchers to authorize the institution as a trusted party on their ORCID record in order to establish an authenticated connection between the researcher and the institution and easily read and query affiliated researchers' ORCID data. So in this process, users are asked to either create a new ORCID ID if they don't already have one, or connect their existing ORCID ID by logging into their ORCID record. From there, the user is presented with an authorization screen asking for permission for the institution to connect with their ORCID record. In this example, the institution is asking permission to add or update research activities within the individual's record and to read any limited access information that may be listed in their ORCID record. Users can also optionally be presented with an option to acknowledge either one-time or lasting permissions. So typically, unless otherwise stated, once a user clicks authorize, these permissions will remain in place for 20 years. So when this connection is authorized, your institution would appear as a trusted organization on the individual's ORCID record, where they can see the details of your organization and the permissions that they have granted. So in this example, we're seeing California Digital Library has asked to get our ORCID ID, and editorial manager has asked for permission to read limited access information from our ORCID record. So just a few examples of institutions that are asking researchers to create and connect include American University. So as you can see here, they've got their create or connect ORCID ID button that prompts the user to connect, and they've also got additional information on the page about ORCID and its benefits for the researcher. And also the University of Pittsburgh is another example where they're also asking researchers to connect, and they've also got links to additional information about ORCID and where to go with questions. So we're starting to see more of these interfaces coming up around the United States. So with this secure connection in place, when a student graduates or when a faculty member moves on to a new job, your institution can remain connected with them through ORCID to see, for example, what works they're producing and what organizations they become affiliated with after they leave your institution to better understand the impact that your institution has across the wider landscape. The Joint Information Systems Committee, or JISC, in the UK created an institutional cost-benefit analysis report for ORCID where they pointed out that ORCID can benefit institutions by providing real opportunities to support greater understanding through analysis and data mining techniques of inferred relationships between individuals, research communities, and institutions. The Australian Access Federation, which serves as the ORCID membership consortium for institutions in Australia, recently shared some visualizations that they created using ORCID data to map collaborations between individuals at Australian universities and other institutions around the globe. And this is another rendition of those connections and collaborations, again using data from ORCID, which really shows the potential for tracking activities and impact by using that ORCID data. And one last example of this, this is actually an interactive visualization that was created for an article in Science magazine that shows migration patterns of scientists across the globe based on ORCID data. The article actually provides additional graphs and statistics, and I would encourage afterwards when the slides are sent out to visit the link here because it's actually a very interesting article. But you can imagine being able to do something like this for the researchers that have been affiliated with your institution, showing where they've come from and where they've gone, and ultimately where your institution has had an impact. And then finally, this tweet really sums up the notion that ORCID provides a powerful tool for assessment activities for things like tenure and promotion, for example, and can be used in this way to the advantage of research institutions. And many institutions in the US are still kind of in the planning stages or just getting started with using ORCID to do things like track and assess researcher activities, but we are moving in this direction. So once your institution enables connections with researchers through ORCID, you can also benefit by asserting information onto individuals' ORCID records and contributing trustworthy and accurate data to the research and scholarly communications ecosystem. So when it comes to assertions in ORCID data, when individual researchers enter their affiliations themselves, there can be all sorts of variations in how your institutional name is represented. For example, the University of California at Los Angeles. As you can see here, there is kind of a range of affiliations using either UCLA or University of California, Los Angeles with a comma or without a comma. And also accidental misspellings can also cause issues. So it's really beneficial for institutions to be able to assert control over how they want their names to appear in ORCID. For example, the University of Virginia is doing this in their institutional repository. They have asked researchers to connect via ORCID so that when a publication goes into their repository, they can display the ORCID ID next to the author's name, and that ID link is clickable, so when you go to an author's ORCID record, you can see their article listed there with the source of the information as the University of Virginia. So this benefits the institution by ensuring accurate and consistent data, and it contributes back to the wider ORCID ecosystem. And the individual in this case also benefits because they don't have to worry about typing in manually this publication information. The University of Virginia has populated that information for them on their behalf with their permission. Another example of this, Boston College is also asserting affiliations, in this case for employment. So they're connecting with researchers and writing that employment information to their ORCID records, and the source of that data is Boston College. So again, writing to ORCID and making these kinds of trusted assertions benefits the institution, the individual, and other stakeholders in that ORCID ecosystem. So by using ORCID to disambiguate and connect with researchers, reading ORCID data to assess contributions and measure impact, and asserting trustworthy and accurate affiliations, institutions can ultimately save time and reduce administrative burden, both for institutional administrators and individual researchers. The more people and systems that are plugged in and using ORCID, the more all parties can benefit and save time. Just to give you a global overview, there are over 5 million individuals that are registered and have ORCID IDs right now, and that number is growing steadily. We've got over 900 organizations across the globe that are ORCID members, which means they have invested in using ORCID and maintaining the ORCID registry. And there are over 550 systems that have ORCID integrations that are contributing to the growing ORCID data ecosystem. At the institutional level, once your systems are making authenticated connections with affiliated researchers, displaying ORCID IDs to mitigate name ambiguity, reading information from ORCID records, and writing information to ORCID records, your systems can then be synchronized with the ORCID registry to allow for automated updates and transfer of data anytime updates are made to your researchers' ORCID records, either by other systems or by the individuals. In this way, researchers' ORCID records can be automatically updated, where you can see in this tweet, for example, that the researcher received an ORCID notification about a new publication even before they received a notification from the publisher. And institutional systems can receive these kinds of automatic updates and notifications as well. So with this automated transfer of data, individuals can spend less time entering information in forms and updating their records, and institutional administrators can spend less time checking form entries for accuracy and tracking down data needed for various workflows. And I've got another tweet for you that illustrates an example from the Australian Catholic University, where their grant application system is connecting with researchers' authenticated ORCID IDs, importing works data from ORCID records, and then pre-populating forms to save time for both researchers and administrators. So as more and more stakeholders in the wider scholarly communications ecosystem start using ORCID, everyone can benefit from the efficiencies that ORCID can provide. So publishers, for example, are increasingly using ORCID in their workflows, and many journals require an ORCID ID from authors in their submission process. What you're seeing here is a screenshot of the top part of an open letter that over 60 publishers have signed, confirming that they are committed to ultimately requiring ORCID IDs in their workflows. So ORCID can not only benefit research institutions, but publishers are benefiting as well. And also funders, another big stakeholder in the ORCID ecosystem. Funders are increasingly looking to ORCID, and there's currently an ORCID funders working group that's comprised of funding organizations from around the globe, and they're working on enhancing the ORCID data model to include even more functionality to support funding workflows. And as you can see from this list of the participants in that funders working group, we've got the NIH in the US, and they've been a very active and vocal group on behalf of ORCID. Within the US, we've also got the National Humanities Alliance there and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And those are just the US representatives. So we'll be seeing more from ORCID with regard to funders in the coming future. So to recap our benefits here, using ORCID can help with name disambiguation, assessment, assertions of accurate affiliations, and also saving time and effort. And if you want to get started with using ORCID and working towards these benefits at your institution, a good place to start is with forming some sort of ORCID group or committee that's comprised of stakeholders from all of the various units at your institution to start discussing ORCID and thinking about how it could be leveraged at your institution. So in doing that, take account of all of the different systems and workflows at your institution that could be improved by connecting with ORCID and ORCID data. And at the same time, start working with faculty and students to encourage them to register for their ORCID ID and populate their data. Reaching out to researchers and educating them about what ORCID is and how it can benefit them is really key to ensuring the organizational benefits of ORCID. So the more researchers who are actually using ORCID, the more efficiently information can be read and shared. And there are many ways to encourage researchers to use ORCID, whether it's hosting an ORCID event or including a presentation about ORCID at new faculty or new student orientation, or just passing out flyers or bookmarks that are promoting ORCID. The examples on this slide are actually from just last week, which was Open Access Week, where several institutions were getting out there, interacting with students and faculty, and doing that ORCID outreach and education there. So once you've done some initial thinking and planning at your institution, and you think that you want to move forward, the best way to really get the most value from ORCID and achieve all of the benefits that we covered today is to become an ORCID member. And what that does is the ORCID membership provides institutions with access to the premium ORCID API. And you can find this information on the ORCID website. But the premium ORCID API is what really allows for all of the benefits that we covered today. So connecting with authenticated ORCID IDs, reading limited access data, writing to ORCID, and using that data to pre-populate forms and that kind of thing. So in the US, there are currently 107, as of today, research institutions here in the US that are currently taking advantage of this ORCID membership through a consortial approach known as the ORCID US community. And this community was formed early this year, in early 2018, and it was a partnership initially between Lyrasis, the Big Ten Academic Alliance, the Northeast Research Libraries, and the Greater Western Library Alliance. And currently Lyrasis is the administrative lead for this group. And what this consortial approach does is it provides a discounted membership fee for ORCID membership, as well as dedicated technical and community support for ORCID adoption. So I am the dedicated support and I'm working with all of these institutions to provide help for technical support, but also building community and helping with outreach and other logistics. And part of the membership includes 5 ORCID API credentials that can be used to integrate ORCID with 5 systems, like we talked about. And members also receive a monthly newsletter and a statistics report from ORCID, so you can stay in the loop with the global ORCID community and also keep track of ORCID adoption locally. And I just want to note that institutions do not have to be a member of any of these 4 consortia to join the ORCID US community. Now that we have this group, any research institution in the US can join the ORCID US community. And one of the goals of this ORCID US community is to build really a community of practice around ORCID in the US. So prior to this year, there really hadn't been a dedicated communication channel or platform for institutions to share and talk to each other about ORCID. So one of the things that we've done over the summer is we've set up a discussion forum that you see here for members to specifically discuss and share what they're doing with ORCID, questions they might have, things that have worked well for them, and help them to find other institutions that may be using the same systems. And so just really building that support network and allowing institutions to more easily utilize the collective wisdom of the community. And we also have a website that is at orcid-us.org, where you can go to learn more about the community, membership, technical support, community resources, and ways to get involved, and also frequently asked questions. So I would encourage everyone to head over there and take a look as you start to think about ORCID at your institution. And I would say if you're located in the US, the ORCID US community web pages are the best place to start for learning more. And I do also want to point out that on our community resources page, we have a planning guide that you can look at and print out. And it basically walks through the initial steps of the types of things that institutions would need to think about when adopting ORCID. including considerations for technical integration and also for outreach and education. So that's one of the resources that we have that will be helpful to you when you go and leave this webinar. And in addition to the ORCID US community website, we also have a listserv that anyone can join, both members and non-members, and so you can stay in the loop with what's going on with ORCID in the US. We also have Twitter, so please feel free to follow us on Twitter. We announce various events like webinars, but also if we'll be at conferences or just other exciting news about ORCID. And all of this information can be found on the website at orcid-us.org. And if your institution is a member, or if you want to become a member, you'll have access to that members discussion forum as well. So that is bringing me to the end of my slides here. If you would like more information, feel free to send an email to orcidus@lyrasis.org. Look at our website, follow on Twitter, and at this point I think we're going to open it up for questions. So if there are any questions out there, please feel free to type them in. Okay, I see one question. If my institute is not a member, can I still avail the data on collaboration of my faculty? So that's a really good question. So if your institution is not a member, there is a public API for ORCID. The information with the public information that's available, is more limited. So we talked about the fact that individuals have full control over their own ORCID data and the visibility of their data. So it really depends on the researchers at your institution and whether they've set their ORCID record and the data within to either be publicly visible, or if they've set it to trusted parties only or private. Any data that is set to public, you can use the public API to query that data. You may run into issues with, like we talked about, the institutional name being formatted in different ways. Also, you probably won't be able to get information like their email addresses. So it really just kind of depends. It's a little bit less reliable and more limited data, but you can certainly still use the public API. And also at the ORCID website at just orcid.org, at the very top there's a search box where you can do kind of this manual searching for affiliations and that kind of thing, but that's really just in a graphical user interface. You're not going to be able to get like a CSV file or that kind of thing. But I would encourage you to explore the public API, and if you have any questions, you can contact me and let me know. Okay, I'm going down the list here. We have a question about the cost structure for membership. So basically the ORCID membership structure is set up to where individual institutions joining on their own are paying a much higher membership fee as opposed to institutions that join as a group or as a consortium. So that's one of the reasons why in the United States all these research institutions have come together to form the ORCID US community, so we can benefit from a lower membership rate for each of the individual institutions. So I think if you go, there's a web page, and it's linked from the ORCID US site on the membership page, but ORCID has a page on their site that outlines their membership structure, and off the top of my head, it's something like there's a basic membership, and then there's the premium membership. And what the consortial approach provides is access to that premium membership and the premium API. So I would encourage you to go check that out. You can visit that from our ORCID US page. If you just click on the little membership tab towards the middle of the page, you'll see some links there and some additional resources. But right now in the US, becoming a member through the ORCID US community is really the most cost-efficient way to get the benefits of ORCID. And in addition to that, you're also plugged into the community of practice that we're building. Okay, let's see. All right, so the next question says, regarding assessment of an author's impact, are there any plans to include metrics like time cited or an author's H-index to an author's ORCID record so that the information is also pullable into an institution's faculty evaluation system? I know that ORCID is continuously, revisiting and adding data points and additional information to the ORCID record. In terms of the types of metrics you're talking about, number of times cited or an author's H-index, I have not heard of plans to do that, but that doesn't mean that that's not being considered. So I will have to look into that and see if I can find more information about that, but that is a really good question. So thank you for that question. And yeah, as far as I know, at this time, I have not heard of plans for that. But I think that would be a good idea. And if you'd like to, ORCID has it's something called the Ideas Forum, and that's listed on the ORCID US site under the Get Involved page. And that's where they take a lot of feedback from the community regarding ideas for future things that would be helpful to add into ORCID records to make it more valuable. So that would be a good question or point for the Ideas Forum. And then why ORCID instead of ISNI? That's a good question as well. So ORCID was really created specifically for the kind of research, scholarly communications realm, especially, well, and then that's a good question because I also just saw yesterday there's a blog post on the ORCID site. Let me see if I can actually find it and give you the link. ORCID and ISNI are kind of, they have slightly different purposes, but there's an overlap there. And on the ORCID blog, I'll paste a link into the chat here. There's a statement from 2013 about ORCID and ISNI working together and partnering. If you follow that link there, you'll see a statement directly from ORCID about that. So they've got different missions but have kind of different processes, and so there's different goals there, but they're overlapping, so you can learn more there. And I am the folks at the ORCID organization would be able to give you more information about that. And I am not actually representing ORCID. I'm representing basically all of the member institutions in the US that are ORCID members. Any other questions? These are really great. Thank you all who have asked questions so far. And like I said earlier, we will have a recording of this webinar, and that link will be sent out along with a copy of the slides, so you'll be able to revisit all of this content after we conclude here. I think I saw someone typing, but not anymore. Are there any other questions? Okay. So we have a question, we have a couple of different questions. Are there any plans to further expand ORCID ties to NCBI tools? It's tied to the Science CV tool for biosketches, but there's